J'entends vif et pointu.
He's lively and sharp.
Bon, il se distingue par sa parole.
He distinguishes himself through his words.
Le Paul des Actes se distingue par son
Paul
comportement,
in
par son agir.
Acts distinguishes himself through his
Luc a
behavior,
l'intention de
through his
dresser
actions.
un portrait de Paul en action. Et l'action de Paul,
And
selon
Paul's
les Actes,
action,
n'est pas pâle du tout.
according
Au
to
contraire.
Acts,
Elle est vraiment
is not
héroïque.
pale at all. It's very heroic.
Alors, il est parfaitement vrai que la manière dont Luc va fixer le
It's true
discours de
that Paul's
Paul
discourse,
n'est
as
pas
Luke
à la
records
hauteur
it,
de la rhétorique
doesn't
paulinienne.
live up to Pauline rhetoric.
Mais là encore, Luc, 30
But
ans
again,
après, doit
Luke,
dire d'autres choses.
30 years later,
Il va
has to
il
say
va pas
other
répéter
things.
ce que tout le monde sait.
He's not going to
Ce
repeat what
qu'il doit
everyone
dire à
already
ce
knows.
moment-là, c'est la
What he must express at that
fondamentale
time is
volonté
Paul's
de Paul de se
fundamental
situer dans la
desire to
continuité
situate
du
himself
temps
in
du
the
Père.
continuity
Paul, par
of the
tous les
fathers of
moyens,
Israel.
tente, mais ce sera un échec.
Paul tries by every
Tente
means, though he
de
fails,
maintenir le lien
to maintain
entre
the
la
tie between the synagogue
et
and the
les
communities
communautés
he created.
Donc je dirais, il y a une figure
So I'd say
héroïque,
there's the
une
historical
figure
figure,
cinglante, une
a
figure
scathing,
haute en couleur,
highly colorful
mais
figure.
c'est le Paul,
But that is Paul the man
Paul
of
d'action,
action,
le Paul missionnaire,
Paul the
le Paul
missionary,
entrepreneur
Paul the
que l'on
entrepreneur.
voit à l'œuvre. C'est celui
He is the
qu'il nous
Paul we
faut
have to guess
deviner
at in the letters,
derrière
whom the
les
letters
épîtres,
themselves
mais que
don't
les
speak
épîtres
about.
comme tels ne disent pas.
Two portraits of Paul. One from his own letters, where Paul is quite a radical, dynamic Christian leader who has, in certain respects, moved away from some of the central tenets of Judaism, and the portrait that Luke paints in the book of Acts, where Paul is a pious, law-abiding Jew. Yes, there are two quite different portraits, the self-portrait of Paul and the portrait that Luke paints a whole generation later.
Ce qui est évident, c'est que
What's
d'un
obvious
côté,
is that,
on a un personnage
on
qui
the one
parle de
hand,
lui-même,
you have a
qui
character who
parle pas
speaks
beaucoup
about
de lui-même,
himself.
d'ailleurs.
Actually, he
Il se décrit
doesn't
pas
speak about
énormément,
himself that much.
Il se décrit
He doesn't describe himself all that much. He sometimes describes a circumstance or an element he wants to clarify,
Il n'écrit pas une autobiographie.
but he isn't writing an autobiography.
Les épîtres de Paul, ce sont des écrits de circonstances.
Paul's letters are writings of circumstance.
Ce sont des épîtres.
They're epistles.
C'est une évidence.
It's
Mais
obvious,
c'est une évidence qu'il faut
but it's
prendre en
something you
compte
have to take into
pour peser
account
les éléments
to judge the
qu'il
things
donne
he
sur
says about
lui-même.
himself.
C'est des éléments qui apparaissent d'une façon complètement
They appear in a
aléatoire,
completely
disparate
random, disparate way in his
dans le
letters
texte de ses épîtres, et
when
à
he wants to
l'occasion,
elaborate on or
parfois,
justify something.
d'une précision qu'il veut donner ou d'une justification. Donc c'est pas du tout un portrait continu et précis.
So it's not at all a
sur
continuous,
lui-même.
precise portrait of himself.
Et en même temps, c'est un
And
personnage
at the
qui
same
parle de
time,
lui-même.
he's a character who's talking about himself.
Alors que les actes, c'est
Whereas in Acts, someone
une
else
autre
is talking
personne
about Paul.
qui parle de Paul. Donc déjà, rien que cet élément qui paraît
This
neutre,
element alone, which
va
seems neutral,
infléchir
will alter the image
complètement,
given of Paul completely.
au moins l'image qui est donnée de Paul.
Les actes fournissent finalement une certaine ossature.
Acts ultimately gives the
à la
life
vie
of
de
Paul
Paul.
a kind of
Si,
framework.
si nous n'avons que
If
les
we only have the
épîtres,
letters,
les détails biographiques sont peu nombreux.
as the biographical
La
details are so few,
reconstitution d'une chronologie est
reconstructing a
extrêmement
chronology
difficile.
is extremely difficult.
Donc les auteurs qui mettent en question la crédibilité
So
des
the authors
actes
who question the
et qui
credibility of
essayent
Acts,
d'écrire une
and who therefore try to write works on Paul independently of Acts,
indépendamment
have a very hard time.
donc des actes ont de très grandes difficultés et plus ou moins inconsciemment
And more or less consciously,
sont
they're forced to
obligés
incorporate biographical
d'incorporer,
details from Acts.
des détails biographiques des actes.
Mais les actes n'écrivent pas une biographie de Paul. C'est ça le problème. C'est pas une biographie
But
de
Acts
Paul.
is not a biography of Paul.
Il faut
That's
bien
the problem.
Nous, on l'utilise pour faire une biographie de Paul. Parce
We
que,
use it to
à
write
part
Paul's
les épîtres, on n'a
biography,
pas d'autres éléments.
because apart
que
from the
les
letters,
actes
we
des
have no
apôtres.
other elements,
Donc,
only the Acts of the
pour nous,
Apostles.
c'est une source
So
historique.
for us, it's a
pour
historical
écrire
source
une
for writing
biographie de
Paul's
Paul.
biography.
Mais,
But Acts was not written
mais
as a
les actes
biography.
n'ont pas été écrits comme une biographie.
Around 80 to 90, the author of the Acts of the Apostles seizes hold of the figure of Paul. Paul then becomes the hero of a story, which may no longer have much to do with him, with what his letters have to teach us. History gives way to literature.
Paolo diventa l'eroe non degli Atti degli Apostoli.
Paul becomes the
di Luca,
hero not of the
diventa
Acts of the
l'eroe di un
Apostles or of
racconto
Luke,
generale
but the hero of a story
di
about the early
una storia
church,
della Chiesa primitiva
where people
come
live
di una
together in
comunità
harmony.
di persone che vivono una situazione di sostanziale armonia, cioè diventa l'eroe in un quadro
He
predeterminato.
becomes the hero in a predetermined
Questa
setting.
inserzione di Paolo in questo
But there's a high
quadro
price to
costa
pay
prezzi
for
molto
fitting
alti
Paul
dal
into
punto
this
di vista
setting
storiografico,
from the
e non
historian's point
poteva
of view.
essere altrimenti, insomma.
Alors, personnellement, je pense que nous devons être extrêmement
Personally, I think we should be extremely
circonspect
circumspect and prudent about the information given in the
que-
Acts of the Apostles.
Le problème est le suivant, n'est-ce pas?
Because the problem
Quand on
is,
n'a
when you
aucune
have
idée
no
sur
idea
quelque
whatsoever
chose,
about
n'importe
something,
quelle mauvaise
any
idée est
bad
meilleure que
idea
pas
is better
d'idée.
than no idea at all.
En ce qui concerne le début de l'histoire
As far as the
de l'apostolaat
early
pauline,
history of the Pauline
c'est-à-dire
apostolate is concerned,
depuis
that is,
l'appel,
from the time Paul
la
is
vocation
called,
de Paul,
what we now
ce qu'on
call
appelle
his
la
conversion,
conversion, mais c'est depuis la vocation de Paul,
until his trip to
jusqu'à son
Corinth
passage à Corinthe,
in the mid-50s,
au milieu des années 50. Là, on a des données,
there
des
we
lettres
have
de Paul.
data, Paul's
Ces
letters.
données contredisent pour une grande partie
To a large
les
extent,
données qu'on
this
a dans les
data
Actes des Apôtres.
contradicts the data in the
Et
Acts of
ensuite,
the
on n'a plus
Apostles.
rien, n'est-ce pas? La dernière chose qu'on
Then
a,
there's
c'est dans
nothing
l'Épître
else.
aux Romains, c'est
The
l'intention
last
de
thing we
Paul
have in
d'aller à
Romans
Jérusalem, puis en
is
Espagne.
Paul's intention to
Mais
go
de
to
là, de
Jerusalem
ça, on n'a plus
and
rien
later
du
to
tout.
Spain.
Et alors,
But we
là,
have
on n'a
nothing
plus que
more
les
on
Actes
that
des
at all.
Apôtres, n'est-ce pas? Et alors, par
All that's left
paresse,
is the Acts of the Apostles.
on se fie aux
So out
Actes
of
des Apôtres.
laziness, we
Je
trust
pense
the
que c'est
Acts of the
extrêmement
Apostles.
dangereux parce que
I think it's
les
extremely
Actes des Apôtres
dangerous
n'ont pas
because
montré
the
leur
Acts of the Apostles
fiabilité
hasn't proven
dans
trustworthy
le
in
récit
telling
des
the
premières
story
années
of
de
the
la
early
biographie
years of
paulinienne,
Paul's
et c'est la raison
biography.
pour laquelle je serai très très prudent vis-à-vis de tout le récit du
That's why I'd be
voyage
very
de
prudent about the whole
Paul à
story of
Jérusalem,
Paul's
le
last
dernier
trip to
voyage de Paul à
Jerusalem,
Jérusalem, son arrestation,
his
son
arrest,
procès,
his trial,
son arrestation à
his captivity in
sa
Caesarea,
captivité à Césarée,
his trip
le
to
voyage
Rome.
à Rome. Enfin, sur toutes ces questions, je serai extrêmement prudent.
I'd be extremely prudent about all these
Et au
questions.
fond, en ce qui
And
concerne
as
la
far as the
biographie
biography
de
of
Paul,
Paul
je m'arrêterai à
goes,
Corinthe
I'd
et je
stop at
dirai
Corinth.
ensuite, tout est extrêmement
Finalement, si on se fie simplement à ce que Paul raconte
If we simply
lui-même,
trust in
nous
what
savons
Paul
pas
says about
grand-chose, et
himself,
lorsqu'il nous
we don't
donne
know much at
certains
all.
renseignements
And when he
précis,
does give us precise information,
nous
it can
pouvons
leave us
rester
perplexed.
perplexes. Par exemple, quand il nous
For
dit
example,
qu'après
he says that
avoir
after
été à
having been in
Damas,
Damascus,
il
he
est
spent
parti
several
pendant
years in
plusieurs années
Arabia.
en Arabie. Qu'est-il allé faire
What
en
was he
Arabie?
doing in
On ne sait
Arabia?
pas.
We don't know.
Le livre des Actes
The
ne
book
nous
of
parle
Acts
pas de
doesn't
ses
mention him
déplacements
traveling
en
to
Arabie.
Arabia,
Ça aurait été pourtant
but
bien
it would have been
intéressant
interesting
de
to
savoir
know what
ce
he was
qu'il allait
doing
faire
there
et qui il avait
and
pu
whom he met
rencontrer.
there.
Il dit qu'il revient
He says
à
he comes
Damas
back to Damascus
parce qu'il était
because
pourchassé par
Aretas,
le
the king of
recherché
Arabia,
par
is hunting him
Aretas, le
down.
roi d'Arabie. Qu'est-ce qui s'était passé
What happened
entre
between
ce
the king
roi
and
et
him
lui,
that he'd be
ou
chased to
entre
Damascus?
l'Arabie et lui pour qu'il soit
We don't know
pourchassé
that
jusqu'à
either.
Damas? Nous ne savons pas non plus. Que nous raconte le livre des
What does
Actes,
the book
c'est
of
qu'à
Acts tell
Damas,
us? That in
il
Damascus he
rencontre
comes up against
une
opposition from Hellenists,
opposition ferme de gens qui sont des
and they
hellénistes.
chase him away.
On est obligé de le faire fuir, etc. On montre encore à Damas
That in Damascus
la
people
rue
still
où
point out
Paul
the street
s'est
where Paul
enfui
escaped through a window.
via une fenêtre et dans un
basket.
panier. Mais tous ces détails,
But all
comme
these details,
le fait qu'il aurait
like the fact
été,
that,
selon
according to
le
a speech
discours de
Paul
Paul
gives
dans
in
les
Acts,
Actes,
he's supposed to have
élève
been brought up
élevé
at the
aux
feet
pieds
of
de
Gamaliel
c'est-à-dire disciple
as
de
his
Gamaliel,
disciple.
on peut
You'd think
penser
that when
quand
Paul
Paul
speaks
se
about his
réclame
Jewish
du
lineage and
conseil
Pharisaic
juif
faith,
et de
he'd
sa
mention the
foi
name of Gamaliel.
pharisaique, il aurait
He
mentionné
doesn't.
le nom de Gamaliel, il ne le fait pas.
Alors, qu'il soit pharisien, il le dit lui-même.
So the fact that he's a Pharisee and comes from the tribe of Benjamin, he says so himself in his letter to the Philippians,
qu'il n'a jamais été à Jérusalem.
and that he'd never been to Jerusalem before his first
La
visit to
première
meet
visite qu'il
Peter,
a faite à
3
Pierre pour
years
faire sa
after he was
connaissance,
called.
3 ans après
He
sa
says that in his
vocation.
letter to the
Ça, c'est
Galatians.
ce qu'il dit dans l'Épître aux Galates. Donc l'idée qu'il ait été l'élève de
So the
Gamaliel,
idea that he
qu'il ait fait
studied
ses
under
études à
Gamaliel
Jérusalem, me semble contredit
seems to me to be
par les
contradicted
Épîtres.
by the letters.
Qu'il soit citoyen romain,
Whether he was a
j'en
Roman
sais rien,
citizen,
ça passe en tout cas
I have
bien
no idea.
dans le paysage
But it certainly is
lucanien.
Luke's way of seeing.
Qu'il sache l'hébreu,
Whether he
c'est
speaks
aussi une
Hebrew,
affirmation
as the
des
Acts of the
Actes des
Apostles
Apôtres.
says,
Ça me paraît
seems
plus
rather
plausible
implausible
que
to me,
quand
considering
c'est
his
les lettres.
letters.
La Bible de Paul, c'est la Septante.
Paul's Bible is a
c'est pas
Septuagint.
le
It's not the
texte
Hebrew
hébraïque.
text.
Donc je crois que nous avons là beaucoup de traits.
So I think a lot of features have been added or introduced by Luke in the biography to root Paul in Jerusalem.
C'est de raciner Paul à Jérusalem. Et je pense que c'est un racinement de Paul à
This is
Jérusalem,
contradicted by the letters,
contredit par
but
les
actually
épîtres,
it's part of
mais
the
que,
literary
en fait,
plan of
il
Acts.
appartient au projet littéraire des Actes.
Alors, comment peut-on expliquer cela?
So how can we explain this?
Il y a, je dirais, deux
I would say there are
manières de
two
le
ways
faire.
of doing so.
La première, en se disant que l'un des deux a tort.
The first is to say
Entre
that one of
Paul
them is
et
wrong.
Luc, l'un des deux a tort.
Either Paul
et
or
généralement,
Luke,
le
one of
coupable
them
est
is
vite
wrong.
trouvé. On désigne
And generally,
l'auteur
it's
des
easy
actes
to see
comme
who's
étant,
guilty. Author of
soit
Acts is
un
designated
historien
either as an extremely
extrêmement peu
sloppy
attentif
or
ou
poorly
mal
informed
renseigné,
historian,
soit alors tout simplement un
or simply as a
falsificateur d'histoire.
falsifier of history.
Et à mon avis, trancher comme ça est complètement inadéquat.
I think that taking a
C'est
stand like that
complètement
is completely
inadéquat parce qu'on
inadequate.
oublie deux
It's inadequate
choses.
because you forget
Un,
two things.
quand
One,
Luc écrit.
when Luke was writing.
Deux, ce que c'est qu'écrire l'histoire.
Two, what it means to write history.
Alors, quand Luc écrit-il?
So when
Il
was
écrit
Luke writing?
entre 80 et 90.
He was writing between 80 and 90.
Nous sommes donc 30 ans après
So that means
la
30
mort
years after
de
the
Paul.
death of Paul.
Paul est mort, disons, autour de 60.
Paul died around
Très
60,
éventuellement 60.
perhaps around
Nous
64.
sommes 30 ans après, au moins.
It's 30 years later, at
Et
least.
Luc,
And
lui,
Luke's writing is in keeping with his
écrit
heritage.
dans une phase qui est celle de l'héritage.
The story of the road to Damascus revolves around a zealous Pharisee named Saul who persecutes Jesus' followers. After having a revelation, Saul joins the Christians and later takes the name Paul. Against all expectations, Paul's letters never mention this episode in which he is supposed to have forsworn Judaism.
Now, in Galatians, the conversion or the call of Paul is expressed very, very briefly indeed, but the fundamental central point is the same as we find in Luke's three accounts. Now, Luke tells the story in a very colourful way with lots more detail, but the central element in each case is the same. Curiously, in the book of Acts, Luke feels that this experience that Paul had was so important that he tells the same story 3 times over, with just some relatively minor changes in detail. There's a slightly different emphasis in each case that relates to the part of the story, the overall story that Luke is telling, and the audience that is in view in each case.
Donc, du chapitre 9 des Actes des Apôtres, la vocation de Saul. Saul, ne respirant toujours que menaces et meurtres contre les disciples du Seigneur, alla demander au grand prêtre des lettres pour les synagogues de Damas. S'il trouvait là des adeptes de la voie, hommes ou femmes, il les amènerait enchaînés à Jérusalem. Poursuivant sa route, il approchait de Damas quand soudain une lumière venue du ciel l'enveloppa de son éclat. Tombant à terre, il entendit une voix qui lui disait « Saoul, Saoul, pourquoi me persécutes-tu » ? « Qui es-tu, Seigneur » demanda-t-il. « Je suis Jésus, c'est moi que tu persécutes. Mais relève-toi, entre dans la ville et on te dira ce que tu dois faire. » Ses compagnons de voyage s'étaient arrêtés muets de stupeur. Ils entendaient la voix, mais ne voyaient personne. Saul se releva de terre, mais bien qu'il eût les yeux ouverts, il n'y voyait plus rien. Et c'est en le conduisant par la main que ses compagnons le firent entrer dans Damas, où il demeura privé de la vue pendant 3 jours sans rien manger ni boire.
Que Paul se soit rallié au christianisme, c'est évident.
The fact that Paul was won over to Christianity is
Soit
obvious.
de la façon, de la manière dont les
Whether it happened the way the story of the road to Damascus is told 3 times in the book of
récits sur le
Acts,
chemin de Damas, je crois que là, on touche plus à la
I
littérature
think there we're
qu'au
touching on
récit historique.
literature more than on historical record.
Et si, par hasard, les théologiens se
And
plaignaient
if theologians
que les
happen to
textes
complain that the New Testament
néo-testamentaires
texts are
soient
considered
considérés comme de la
literature,
littérature,
they're wrong.
ils auraient tort.
Je crois que Paul lui-même, le Paul historique,
I think
l'on
that
peut
Paul himself,
reconstruire à partir
the
de ses
historical
épîtres.
Paul we can reconstruct from his letters.
Paul a compris sa vie comme
Paul
marquée
understood his
comme
life
par un avant
as
et un
having a
après.
before and an
Il n'a
after.
cessé de dire
He was
avant
always
j'étais
saying,
un
I used to be a persecutor. Everything was dark. But now everything's good. I'm a great missionary. This before and after structure appears clearly in Galatians. In the past, I persecuted the Church of God in my attempts to destroy it, but God chose to reveal His Son in me so that I should preach Him to the Gentiles. In the Acts of the Apostles, Luke respects the same structure.
Dans l'Épître aux Galates, Paul dit ceci: Vous avez entendu parler de mon comportement naguère dans le judaïsme. Avec quelle frénésie je persécutais l'Église de Dieu et je cherchais à la détruire. Et Paul utilise là un terme très fort pour théo, qui veut dire ravager.
Paul utilizes a very strong term here, porseo, which means to ravage.
Mais lorsqu'il a plu à Dieu de révéler
But when God chose to reveal His Son in me, etc.
Paul dresse un portrait en noir-blanc.
So basically, Paul is painting a portrait in black and white.
C'est le ravage de l'Église.
The black side is his ravaging the
terme,
church.
d'ailleurs, dans les Actes des Apôtres à propos de Paul.
And we find this term
Et puis,
again in the Acts of the
l'autre
Apostles
face,
about Paul.
C'est le Paul
Then the other side of Paul is the
converti,
convert who has had the revelation of the
ayant reçu la
Son
révélation du Fils et devenant le témoin du
and
Fils,
become a witness
de
to the
celui
Son,
qu'il persécutait.
to the one he had been
Cette construction
persecuting.
noir-blanc
This
est
black and
une
white construction
rhétorique
is
qui
rhetoric
dépend
that
de
stems
Paul.
from Paul.
D'ailleurs, il dit bien, vous avez entendu.
And he says, You have surely heard.
Donc c'est un récit qui émane de qui? Mais de lui, bien sûr.
Whom does this story
C'est lui
come
qui l'a-
from?
qui
From
l'a
him, of
raconté.
course. He's the one who
Paul
tells it.
ici fait écho
Paul here is
à un
repeating a
discours
speech
sur
about
lui-même,
himself, in which he himself spoke about this
et dans
turnabout.
lequel
And that is the very
il a
structure
lui-même
of
parlé de
conversion.
ce retournement. Et c'est la structure même d'une conversion.
Quindi questa immagine della conversione di Paolo in
This
cui si
image of
mette
Paul's conversion,
fortemente
which creates
in
such strong
tensione
tension
il
between
periodo
Paul's pre-Christian
pre-cristiano
and
e
Christian
il periodo
periods,
cristiano di Paolo,
tends
è
to
qualcosa
develop in
che ha
Christian
tendenza
tradition.
effettivamente a svilupparsi nella tradizione.
And we can find
e di
traces
cui
of
quindi
it
troviamo
as far
le
as the
tracce
Gospel of
anche
Luke.
nel Vangelo di Luca e del resto nelle lettere pastorali.
As for the rest,
chiaramente
the pastoral
non
epistles
riflette la
don't
coscienza
reflect
di
Paul's
sé che aveva
self-awareness very
Paolo,
well.
perché nelle lettere pastorali Paolo dice
They have him
io ero il
saying,
più grande dei
I
peccatori.
myself am the
In realtà
greatest of
nella lettera
sinners.
ai Galati Paolo dice
In reality, in Galatians,
io
Paul says,
progredivo ero
In Judaism,
avanzato
I outstripped most of my
nell'egiudaismo
Jewish
assoluto, nel
contemporaries
zelo per la
in my
legge,
limitless zeal for the
più
traditions
di
of my
molti miei
ancestors.
coetanei. Io ero quello che meglio di tutti rispettava le
Paul
tradizioni.
claims he was
Cioè
a good
Paolo dice
Jew.
che lui come giudeo era un ottimo
He
giudeo,
doesn't
non
speak
era
about himself
Paolo
as a
non parla di sé
sinner.
come di un peccatore. Paolo dice che era un ottimo giudeo. Naturalmente il suo
Naturally, his fundamental
il suo
sin,
peccato fondamentale, se
if we
così
can
si può
call it
dire,
that,
era quello di non aver
was to not have embraced
accettato
Jesus.
Gesù, ma non si considera come un peccatore.
But he didn't consider
prima
himself
della
a
sua
sinner
vocazione.
before he was
Invece la
called.
tradizione posteriore
Later Christian
cristiana
tradition transformed
trasforma
Paul
il
before his
cristiano
conversion
in un
into a sinner,
peccatore, perché questo permette
making it
di
possible to emphasize the work of
sottolineare
God,
l'opera di Dio che ha
which completely
completamente
turned
rovesciato
Paul's
la
situation
situazione di
around.
Paolo. E anche negli Atti degli
And in the
Apostoli
Acts of the
c'è questa
Apostles,
tendenza,
this tendency to
a
oppose the two periods
contrapporre
is,
i
of
due
course, a
momenti.
literary tendency.
Naturalmente è una tendenza che è in buona parte letteraria.
In his letters, Paul lays claim to one title, that of apostle. He calls himself an apostle. He wants to be thought of as an apostle. He is an apostle, even if this distinction should apparently only be accorded to those who knew Jesus kata sarka, in the flesh. Paul challenges this hierarchy. He considers himself in no way inferior to the Lord's companions. His mystical experience of the risen Jesus confers upon him authority that is at least equal to theirs.
Il y a un texte au chapitre 9
There's a
de la
text
première
in
aux
1
Corinthiens
Corinthians
qui dit qu'il a vu
where he
Jésus.
says he's seen Jesus.
Qu'il a vu Jésus. Il m'est apparu.
Jesus appeared to him.
15 d'un Corinthien, à la suite des
In chapter 15, he says, Last of all, he appeared to me too, as though I was a child born abnormally.
Il dit qu'il l'a vu.
And in chapter 9, he says he's seen Jesus.
Et il veut se mettre sur le rang
He
des
wants
autres.
to put himself in the same league as those who've seen Jesus.
C'est corroboré par sa propre
He
expérience.
has experienced it.
Ça, je
It's
comprends pas,
indisputable.
mais ça, c'est indiscutable. Si vous voulez, il a une vision.
He had a vision.
C'est tout.
Et puis, il va d'autre part, comme chrétien,
Then, on the other
se
hand,
présenter
as a
comme
Christian,
le dernier
he
des
presents
apôtres,
himself as the
mais
last of the
vraiment le dernier
apostles,
au sens le dernier
as
des
the very
derniers,
last of the
n'est-ce pas?
last.
il m'est apparu à moi
He appeared to
comme
me
un
too,
avorton,
as though I was a child born abnormally,
résultat d'une mauvaise
born out of
naissance,
due time.
à moi, Paul.
To me, Paul.
Donc il est, comme toujours, à la fois d'une extrême humilité, ou
So
d'une
he
extrême
is, as
pudeur sur
always,
sa vie, en
both
même
extremely
temps,
humble, extremely
n'hésitant
modest
pas à
about
se
his life,
glorifier certaines choses.
and yet he doesn't
Et la
hesitate to
seule
glorify
chose dont il
himself.
se glorifie, comme
And the
il
only
le
thing
dit,
he glorifies
c'est quand
himself
même
about
d'avoir,
is that he did meet the Lord. He experienced his
rencontré le Seigneur,
resurrection.
enfin, d'avoir eu cette expérience du ressuscité.
Paolo come fa a giustificare
How
la
can
sua
Paul
vocazione
justify his
apostolica
vocation
in
as an apostle
assenza
when he didn't
della
experience the
esperienza
historical
della
Jesus?
sequela del Gesù storico? Come fa?
How does he do it?
La rivelazione diretta.
Through a direct revelation.
La mia chiamata non è dovuta agli uomini e non c'è
The
altra
gospel that was
spiegazione.
preached by me,
O
it was not
accettate
from any
questa
human being that I
spiegazione,
received
oppure
it.
l'apostolato non c'è più. Ecco perché Paolo
Either you
è
accept this
in una
explanation
posizione
or the apostolate no longer exists.
problematica rispetto alla tradizione
This is why
apostolica
Paul's
primitiva.
situation is problematic.
E questo lui lo riconosce chiaramente.
He openly
di non
admits that
aver
he didn't know
conosciuto
Jesus
Gesù
katasarka,
katasarka, secondo la carne.
in the flesh.
Mentre invece, e questa è la cosa interessante della
This is what's
seconda epistola
interesting
ai
about 2
Corinti, che non a
Corinthians.
caso è la lettera nella
He's
quale
trying to
Paolo
justify his
deve
apostolic calling in
giustificare
relation
la
to
sua
those
vocazione
whose credentials are
apostolica
much more valid
contro
than
chi
his.
evidentemente aveva le carte più in regola delle sue.